Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to be here with you and give you a bit of insight about what TDM means in terms of computing and what kind of uh, computation we have to deal with in order to better treat our patients. So my name is Thoma, I'm professor in computer engineering in Yverdon-les-Bains in Switzerland. And I've been the main person responsible for the development of Tucuxi, a new software for helping clinicians with TDM in close collaboration with the CHUV hospital. And so I'm gonna talk about what is inside the software in a sense, with a bit of mathematics, not too much, but just enough to let you know what it means to do TDM in the clinical practice. So, what is TDM? You already know that, I guess, but here I'm just resuming the goals. So, the idea is to assess the normality of an observed concentration of drug concentration in blood, to then define if it's good or not for the patient, and if that's not the case, the idea is to adapt the dosage to fit the patient's need, as we are all different. So for that, we need different things. We need to try to predict the drug concentration at a certain time for a specific patient, and we need to propose percentiles in order to assess the normality, to see whether the patient or the measurement seems all right or totally out of bounds. And then the idea is to try to automate the process of proposing dosage adaptation in order to fit the patient's need. So how can we do that in the practice? So one way of doing this is just the experience of the pharmacologist. Quite nice, but it really depends on the clinician at some stage. They also have some data about, okay, if we know that the patient is in that range of age or suffer that specific disease, then we should give that amount of dose. But still, it requires a lot of knowledge from the clinical practitioner. Then some clinicians or pharmacologists are using Excel sheets with their own models they implemented in that. But the idea is to go to more professional tools. And here you see what Tucuxi looks like. So that's the software we've been developing, and that will serve as a red line around all this presentation. And so the idea is to help the clinician as much as possible to do his job as good as it should be. So how to predict concentration of drug in blood? It's not an easy task, but we can start from the POP-PK studies. So teams of pharmacologists usually that would give some drug to a cohort of patients and then measure the concentration of drug in blood at certain times. And then from that, we can try to predict concentration from this data. So one option is to use model-free systems. It means a kind of machine learning approaches where you just give all the data you have and you try to build a system that from this data can try to predict concentration. It has some limitations. We observed people dealing with supervector machine, for instance, where we could end up with concentration being under 0, which is not that correct in a sense. And one issue is that it's hard to explain such models because it's like a black box where you have an input and an output, and we don't really know what happens inside. So the second option is to use model-based approaches where we try to physiologically represent the patient in order to take advantage of what we know about the body. We have blood circulating the body, we have muscles, livers, and so on. And by using model-based approaches, it's easier to explain what happens to other people. So we will continue with models. And so for these models, every drug is a bit different. And basically, this model will depend on three main parts, which is the route of administration. Is it an oral dose? Is it a bolus or an intravenous drip? What are the number of compartments? Because the idea is to represent the body as some compartments. And then how the body will eliminate a specific drug. And it will really be different for each of the drugs. So just here, a couple of definitions, because we will see that in a couple of slides. So the clearance is basically the elimination speed. So at what rate we eliminate the body, the drug from the body. The volume is basically a volume of a compartment. So that could be the amount of blood we have in the body. We'll have dose, which is how many milligrams, micrograms will give a specific drug. We will use the idea of a residual because we'll have many intakes for one drug, and for each one we'll need the residual concentration from the previous intake, because that when you take a new pill, for instance, you still have some medicine within the blood. We'll have the infusion time that is really necessary for infusion types of intakes, and something which is the bioavailability, which represents the percentage of drug that will actually diffuse into the blood. Because if you take an oral pill, not the entire quantity of drug will end up within the blood. And so from that, we can start with here the most basic model, a bit of mathematics here, but I'll just explain you a bit what it's all about. The idea here is to say, okay, we have one compartment, which would be the blood. We'll put in this compartment a certain amount of drug, which is the dose divided by the volume. And then throughout time, we'll have some elimination of this drug. This elimination will have a certain speed, Ke here, which corresponds to the clearance divided by the volume. So here you have a so-called differential equation that describes at each time what will be the speed of elimination or modification of the concentration within the blood. So that's a pretty simple equation in a sense, and the good thing is that from this differential equation we can derive an analytical one. So depending on the time from the dose, we have this equation with a nice exponential here that describes exactly the amount of drug we will have in the blood. And so we can represent that. For a single dose, we'll have a decrease like this, more or less. If we take multiple doses, then we will accumulate a bit. And we see that quite rapidly here we attain a certain steady state, which is indeed the steady state that should arrive quite rapidly depending on the drug, but typically after 5 doses, 5 intakes, for instance. And so here we attain this steady state. So that's the example of just a linear elimination here with one compartment for the bolus. We can do the same kind of exercise with the infusion. With the infusion, the idea is for a certain period of time you would give an intravenous drip. So for a certain amount of time we add some drug within the blood. At the same time, the drug that is already in will be eliminated, and when we are after this time of infusion, we will just let the amount of drug decrease. And so the good thing is that for these differential equations, we still have an analytical one, a bit more complex than the previous one. For sure, we have 2 exponential here, but still quite easy to calculate in a sense, for a computer at least. And here is what it would look like. Here we have for 2 hours the infusion, and then we just see the decrease, exactly like the curve we had for the bolus one. Then if we take multiple doses, we still have this idea of getting to this steady state that will be reached at a certain point of time after the first dose. Then we have typically a third way of giving the drug that could be an oral pill, for instance. In that case, we consider this one compartment, but actually there is a second one, which is the compartment where we will put the drug in a sense, and from that, the drug will be absorbed to the central compartment here, and at the same time will be eliminated. So we keep this way of saying, okay, we are eliminating from our central compartment, but at the same time, we are taking part of the drug from this second compartment and we'll put that into the central compartment. All right, so we have basically two equations here. One thing is that here we have this bioavailability, that is the amount of drug that will really end up within blood. And so it will also end up with a nice analytical equation, a bit more complex. You see that we are getting into more complex equations here, but still manageable as an analytical one. And it will end up with this very nice curves, the so-called extravascular prediction here, for one dose, for multiple doses, with the same idea that we reach a steady state at some stage in time. So these are the three main kind of models in terms of different absorption methods and linear elimination. For sure, there's a lot of other models. Just for fun, I'm showing you the equations for three compartments. Extravascular, meaning we have another one here. You see a lot of nice differential equations. We won't go into the details of this. They can be described with macro constants here. I won't go into the details for this, just to show you that it can be quite complex and quite hard to find the analytical equations. And so one thing is that we cannot always end up with an analytical equation. For instance, there is a quite well-known elimination called Michaelis-Menten elimination, following that equation, and that actually describes very well how we eliminate alcohol from the blood. Seems very simple, but the issue is that there is no analytical equation for this. So we need to use other techniques for computing things, but it's still manageable. And so every drug is a bit different. A lot of drugs will follow these linear elimination models. In the literature, we see a lot of people that dealt with one compartment or two compartment models that are quite standard, but still there are many ways of describing different models with other compartments, other ways of exchanging drug between these compartments. So these models are actually hard-coded within the software to be very, very efficient, and so a lot of them are available. But at some stage, if someone needs a very specific one, that's the kind of thing we have to add within the software. So just here to show you some other fancy stuff. So here that's so-called Erlang absorption, where we see quite nice curves that are described with these differential equations as well. An example for rifampicin, which is a medical drug for tuberculosis, and where we see an enzyme that has an effect on the drug elimination. And so that's other equations I won't show here, but just to show that there are various variations on this type of PK models. So for each of these models, we have these PK parameters. So it's pharmacokinetic parameters. We saw models where we need a clearance, a volume, residual concentration, and a time. For the extravascular one, we need the bioavailability, the absorption rate, and so on. So each model is a bit different on that. And so now the idea is how to get these parameters. Well, we can see that in papers, we have people that are kind of generating mean parameters for a population. And here, in our case, the idea is to describe these parameters in so-called drug models. I'll show you a bit later on how it looks like, with the idea that we don't need to modify the software for every drug model, but we can just add external files to describe all that. So now we have this idea of we have equations that can be used to predict something. We need parameters on this. And so how do we predict based on what kind of data? So we have three different approaches. Basically, with no information, that would be the typical patient. So the person we don't know anything, we can try to do our best to predict something for this typical patient. Then we should usually have some information about the patient covariates. That would be the sex, the age, body weight, and so on. And thanks to this, we'll have the possibility to modify these covariates. And then the idea in TDM is also to analyze the blood to get a concentration measurement. And based on this and the covariates, we'll have a more precise prediction. And so on these three types, everyone we add data about the patient, we will be more confident in the prediction we will do. So if we start here with the typical patient, that really depends on the population we have. So for instance, if we have a model that is based on adults, maybe the typical patient would be a man, 54 years old and 70 kilos. We can argue that the typical patient could be half man, half woman. That's still something that we could discuss. But obviously, if we use a pop-PK study where the people had the age between 15 and 35, the typical patient wouldn't be 50 years old. So it would be a different patient. Same for neonates, for instance. You wouldn't have the same age for the typical patient. But still, we can do this with kind of a huge uncertainty. And here, for the following, I will take as an example imatinib, which is an anti-cancer drug, and I will base all the data on a paper from Gotha, and that presents actually a model that they developed. So from that paper, we'll read that we have the mean clearance being 14.3 liters per hour, a certain volume, a certain absorption constant, and a certain bioavailability. That's actually something we find here for that specific paper in the supplementary material. And here we have what exactly was within this paper. So we see the estimates for clearance, volume, absorption constant. Based on that, we can generate a typical patient prediction. So here I just added a patient in Tucuxi, and I gave him 400 milligrams every 24 hours for 4 intakes. And so that's the best I can do, knowing nothing about the patient. Then we have these so-called a priori parameters that would be computed based on the covariates of the patient. So as I said, that could be the age, the body weight, the sex, and so on. It really depends on the drug model and would be different for each of the drug models. So here, for instance, what we find in the paper from Gotha is this information, so the covariate models, saying that, okay, we are using the body weight, we are using the age, we are using the sex as well, we see the male here, and the presence or not of a certain pathology. And here we have some equations that can be used to compute the clearance and volume for that specific patient if we know his or her covariates. So here for imatinib, so we have the clearance influenced by age, body weight, sex, and this presence of a gastrointestinal stromal tumor. And for the volume, it's just influenced by sex. And that's something that we will have the opportunity to write within the description of our drug model. So that's the way it would be done in our case. So we have this idea of the a priori volume is the mean volume plus a certain difference based on the age. So that would end up with a man having a volume of 393 and a woman volume of 300. And that would be then this V we use in the PK equations. For the clearance, it's a bit more complex because we have the influence of the body weight, sex, age, and this GIST. And these are exactly the same equations as the one we find in the paper, except that they are written a bit differently. So now here, I'm just showing you, for instance, the influence of the weight of the person on the clearance. So here we know that the body weight has a certain influence here, and we'll use the difference between the weight of the person and the average or mean weight, which is 70 kilos. And that will modify the clearance. So here I'm just drawing the mean clearance, which was 14 something. And then I'm here drawing in blue a curve that corresponds to a male, 50 years old, with the default volume and no GIST. And here we see that that would be the clearance based on this weight. If now we have a man with a GIST, we see that the clearance will be a bit lower than previously. If it's a woman, a female, then it will be lower. And if it's a female with the GIST, it will still be lower. All right? So it's just to show you how the weight would impact the clearance at some stage. We can still observe something here because this imatinib is using a PK model which corresponds to a one compartment extravascular equation. These are the equations I showed you previously. And we see that here we have the clearance divided by the volume that will correspond to the rate of elimination. So what are the limitations of this? Well, basically, if here we have a negative clearance, for instance, or negative volume, it means that we will end up with some spontaneous generation of drug within blood, which doesn't make sense at all. It means that the clearance and volume should be actually positive. And if I go back here, what I see is that based on the influence of the weight on the clearance, then we can end up with a negative clearance. It means that this model has inherently some limitations in the sense that, okay, if I have a person less than 25 kilograms, then I shouldn't use that model because I will end up with a negative clearance. Obviously, we won't have an adult with a body weight less than 25 because it would mean that this person is in a very, very bad shape. But still, mathematically speaking, it means that we have some limitation and we have to really deal with, okay, what can I use in terms of covariate values to have meaningful parameters? And so it comes to the idea of having a drug model, a drug domain, for instance, for one specific model, in the sense that one model would be defined for adults or for neonates, or maybe for intensive care unit patients that are a bit different. And that's very important. That's something we have to know about a model. So I shouldn't use on neonates a model that has been designed for adults, for sure. So now, if I go back to my example of imatinib, that's the typical patient prediction we had previously. And now if we know something about the patient, who is actually a male, 44 years old and 83 kilograms, it's more or less me actually. That's the blue line here that we should predict, that should be more accurate considering what we know about that person. Now, the idea is to get a measurement of drug concentration in blood, and from that, we will be more precise about our prediction. It will allow us to refine the PK parameters, but it's not exactly as easy as it was for a priori parameters. So what can be done? There is a method called least squares that would allow us to say, okay, we'll try to find the individual parameters, so for instance, the clearance and the volume, and for that specific parameter, we'll try to minimize the difference between what we observe, so the real concentration we observe, compared to what we would predict with these parameters, and we took the square of this. So basically, the idea is to try parameters that would end up with a prediction being as close as possible to the observed concentration. If we have more than one measure, then the idea would be just to sum up all these squares right here. So that's pretty easy to do in a sense, but the issue with that is that it's good if we have a lot of measures. If we just have one measure, it's not a very good estimate for parameters. And we have a bigger problem that usually you would have more than one parameters. And so if you try to find two parameters based on just one measure, you end up with an infinite number of best solutions. So which one would be the good one? It's pretty hard to answer to that question. So the idea here is to use the a priori knowledge to deduce the parameters as well. So we have these measures, but we also know that this patient has specific covariates, and we expect that patient to be quite close to the mean person with that covariate. So for that, we use the maximum a priori estimate, COSMAP. Using the Bayes theorem, I will show you a bit about this. And the idea for those who like mathematics would be to find the individual parameters that would end up with the best probability of parameters considering the observation we have. And the idea is to try to find this, which is not exactly easy, but Bayes will help us to find the best parameters based on these observed concentrations. So what does Bayes tell us? From the probability theory, we know that the probability of two events occurring at the same time, A and B, is equals to the probability of one of these events multiplied by the probability of having the second events, considering we already had the previous one. And you can write this in one direction or the other. And so we end up with that, saying that the probability of observing A, considering we have B, is equal to the probability of observing B if we have A, multiplied by the probability of A, divided by the probability of B. That's the way of transferring one conditional probability to the other one, more or less. So just for fun, a small example here of the Bayes theorem. There is a lot of literature around this, just here to show something. If we know, so we know that 5 out of 100 men are colorblind, while only 25 out of 10,000 women are. Now we pick randomly a person in the population. What a person that is colorblind, what is the probability of that person being a man? That's the question. For that we assume gender equity in the sense that the population is composed of 50% of men, 50% of women. So what do we know? We know that the probability of being colorblind, considering the person is a male, is 5%. And the probability of being colorblind, considering the person is a woman, is 25 divided by 10,000. Probability of being a man is the same as being a woman, and is just 0.5. And so from that, we can write this equation here. I won't go into the detail of this, but the idea is that we end up with the idea of, if we pick randomly a colorblind person in the population, we have 20 out of 21 chances of having chosen a man. All right. So in our case, we can go back to base like this in order, because we need to find the probability of the individual parameters considering the observed concentrations. So we use base to derive this. We can consider the probability of the observed concentration as constant, and so this probability is directly related to these two parts. And so we end up trying to find the best individual parameter that would maximize the probability of the observed concentration considering these parameters multiplied by the probability of these parameters. So we need to find the maximum of this. I will just show you in 2 slides what does it mean, these two terms here. So the probability of the individual parameters, for that we'll use so-called inter-individual variability in the way that, okay, we know that the covariates can influence the parameters, but still, if we pick 2 persons with exactly the same covariates, they would not have the same clearance. And so each parameter has some distribution, some error, some variability, and that is related to a distribution function and a standard deviation describing how far from the average we would find parameter values. So we use this inter-individual variability to calculate this. And for the probability of the observed concentration considering the parameter, we will use the intra-individual variability. This intra-individual variability is the idea of, okay, the blood test machines have an error margin. The moment of the day or the patient status has an influence. If the person is tired, if it's before or after lunch, we won't observe exactly the same amount of drug in the blood. And so we represent all that information which within the so-called residual error model that will add some uncertainty around all that. So I won't go into the details of how we use that mathematically speaking, because it's a bit tricky in a sense. But just so you know that we need a residual error model, we need some variability of the parameters to end up with a nice prediction. So if we go back to the paper of Gotta, we see that actually we had this average estimate for the parameters. And now we see also some random effects that are actually the inter-individual variability on clearance in the volume. We also have a covariance, so it means that they are somewhat correlated. And we have a residual error, which here is proportional, which with a certain CV. And so based on this value, we'll be able to calculate the parameter. So here I show you the typical patient with a measure. So I chose one measure at some point in time. We have the a priori, that's the same as I presented previously. And then we have the a posteriori curve. So based on this measure, that was 600 micrograms per liter at that specific point in time, we see that we don't go exactly on the measure. And that's because we are not using least squares approaches, but this Bayes theorem, in the sense that this green curve should be very close to the blue one, because we expect the patient to be close to a usual patient with his covariate. But the measure will attract, in a sense, the prediction towards it. So it's kind of a battle between the a priori curve and the measure. That's why we are just here in the middle. So now we are able to predict concentrations. Now the idea is to say, okay, is that concentration normal compared to the population? So for that we need percentiles. These percentiles are used actually to present the percentage of individuals having values of a certain parameter under a certain value. That's something that is well known by parents, for instance, where you end up with such graph that will let you know if your child is tall or small. And here, for instance, if at the age of 10, your child is around 126 centimeters, then it means he's in the 3% shorter in the population. And that's the way of representing data to compare an individual to the population. So what we do is that we represent this percentile here. So we can see here that we have this a priori curve here. We have the measure, and so it means that this measure is just below the 25th percentile. So it means that the person concentration is below the average, but it's not that a big deal for that specific patient. And so how do we do this? We'll use this inter-individual parameter variability. We use the residual error model, and from that, actually, we generate a lot of random patients. So we generate 10,000 random patients based on this variability, and then we generate predictions for these patients, and then we sort this at each point in time to get exactly the percentiles we need. So it's quite computerly intensive in a sense. What can be done also is to display some a posteriori percentiles that represent different information in the sense that it represents the expected probability of a new concentration measure for that specific patient. And so we calculate that as well in Tucuxi. So we end up here with percentiles that are a bit narrower than what we had previously. And that would let us know where we would expect a next measure for that specific patient. Computationally speaking, it's still more tricky, so I won't go into the details of this. So now we're able to assess the normality of the measure. We can predict, but then the idea is to see whether the dosage that our patient has is good or not. All right. So the idea is to try to adapt that dosage in case it is needed. For doing so, we need so-called therapeutic targets that are basically the targets the pharmacologist would like to see for the specific patients. The idea of a target is that we want to go to that specific value, not being below a minimum, not above a maximum, and then you can use that to propose some dosages. In fact, yeah, the targets can depend on the patient covariates, because if you have some information about the patient, maybe your target would be a bit different. So here I just list, I think, 13 targets that we currently support in Tucuxi. The usual ones are the residual concentration. A lot of people are using the area under the curve, so that the integral of the curve on 24 hours. We can also play with the minimum inhibitory concentration and calculate the area under the curve. Above this, the time spent over this so-called MIC, and so on. So a lot of different options. So if we go back to our example, for imatinib, the target is to be at 1,000 micrograms per liter at the residual. So just before the next intake, we would like to be here. Not less than this, not more than this. So what we see here is that it seems that this patient is a bit underdosed to reach that target. And so the software can take information from our drug models about the available doses, the available intervals, to try to propose something. And here we have two propositions that would end up within the correct range. The best one would be to choose 400 milligrams every 12 hours, but should be quite all right to take 800 milligrams every 24 hours. And so that's basically close to the end of the journey of a pharmacologist for TDM. The last part would be to then select one of the options and and then to end up with a report. So just for this dosage adaptation, as I said, we have the possibility to define exactly what are doses, what are the infusion, the time. For instance, you wouldn't let your patient take the medical drug every 7 hours and 48 minutes. That would be a bit difficult to follow. So you will end up with that kind of values. So at the end, the idea is to validate all that. So fill some information for the interpretation and generate a report. And this report would look like this. That's a PDF that can be exported with some data and a PDF that can be specialized for a specific institution in case. So that's it for exactly what has to be done by a pharmacologist. Just some word about data. We don't have an internal database for the software. We wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So it's still possible to save a current interpretation, and it's also possible to access an external database because every institution will have its own database at some stage. So we implemented something at the CHUV hospital in Lausanne with the idea that all the fields can be automatically filled from the data within the database. The main issue with that being actually the quality of data. If you have a database with free text everywhere, everyone will write some strange things. If you ask for a dose and a unit, people will write strange things in that. And so just show you what we have ready at the CHUV. Actually, Tucuxi is dealing with some XML files, that's a simple file format. The clinical database at CHUV is using HL7v2. That's a standard for health interoperability. And so in the middle, we use something called Mirth Connect that is able to translate a way of communicating to another way of communicating. And finally, this software Tucuxi is quite generic, so the PK equations are hard-coded for performance purpose. And so the drug models are described in XML files. XML is a kind of format. And we can authenticate these files as well to be sure about who did validate these models. And so everyone can write their own models and with the idea of sharing them with the community. So drug model will contain description about the drug, the domain, the available dosages, available intervals, and so on, the targets, the PK parameters, their value, variability, covariates and their influence, and so on. Just as an example here, that's how it looks like for parameter V of the imatinib model of Gotha. So we have the standard value here. We have the influence of the sex covariates on the volume. And we have this between subject variability, which is exponential with that specific standard deviation and some validation of the parameters. So it's quite hard actually to write all that. So we have an editor for this that helps people to write their own models because yeah, it's a bit more difficult to deal with XML like this. In conclusion, well, in terms of software, I would say that a good software for clinicians should at least allow to assess the normality of a measure, thanks to percentiles. It should propose dosage adaptation if required to help as much as possible the clinician, to issue reports that are nice and good looking, should be connected with still the issue that every database is different, so we would need some bridges between various databases. Should be user-friendly. There are a lot of software that are not really that user-friendly and easy to use in a sense. And that should be fast. That's the issue with the percentiles calculation. If you generate 10,000 random patients, it takes a bit of time, so we have to take care about that. And that should be generic enough to easily add new drug models without refactoring, recompiling a lot of things within the software. And so I think that Tucuxi is such an option, and the idea is to have a community of people developing new models, sharing models, and yeah, sharing experiences around this Tucuxi. So that's it for this rapid view of what it means to do TDM in the clinical practice from the computer point of view, more or less. So let's now implement that in the clinical practice.